We're joining you from the traditional territories of the Erie, Neutral, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and the Mississaugas. Today, our guest speaker is Doran from Clarington. Doran will share an overview of Clarington's 5-year EV action plan, and an overview of EV policy and how Clarington distributes responsibilities associated with fleet and EV infrastructure.
My name is Doran Hoge. Thank you very much for having me today. I'm the Energy and Climate Change Response Coordinator for the Municipality of Clarington. I put this picture at the beginning of most of my slides, and I'd like to tell people that it's the sunset or the sunrise, because I think in a lot of different ways, as far as sustainability, climate change go, there's a huge sunrise happening for our municipality, and so many wonderful opportunities for us to learn and share and accomplish some of these sustainability and climate change issues or goals, and reach our targets with our neighboring municipalities. So I'm happy to share anything within this policy and within our plan with any other municipalities that might be here with us today. So again, my objectives today really are, as Juliet had mentioned, to share an overview of Clarington's 5-year EV action plan, provide an outline of our EV policy, and share how our municipality is distributing responsibilities associated with our new EV fleet, because it is new. We've only started onboarding vehicles in the last 2 years, and also the responsibilities with the build out and maintenance. There's been lots of questions internally within our staff about who's responsible for what and how maintenance happens and where the funds come from for that type of maintenance work. And really our objective in this process has been to hash out those details as clearly as possible. I'm providing an overview of our policy because really the plan, because our policy plan and how it's implemented is all quite very intertwined. And so at the end of the presentation, if there's any questions that people have about the specifics of how we came up with any of our solutions that are integrated into policy, happy to go over that with people. So a little bit of background here. On January 22nd, the Municipality of Clarington endorsed the Clarington Electric Vehicle Action Plan. The plan was really created to guide the municipality's corporate transition to electric vehicles over 5 years. It maps out the municipality's annual EV purchases, annual infrastructure needs, and makes recommendations for the timing and ideal locations for EV charging stations. And really, we know that there's a lot of opportunities for electric vehicles in our municipality. Really, the EV really is a guide to transition the municipal fleet and encourage the adoption of electric vehicles to the public, and really provide the needed infrastructure in the service gap that you can see here on this map. The map on this slide demonstrates the number of stations that were in place when we started this work, and just to look at our closest neighbor in Oshawa, Whitby, we're nowhere near what they have going on, and we know that we're going to continue to need to build out this infrastructure. Under this plan, the municipality is set to acquire at least 25 electric vehicles, light-duty electric vehicles in our fleet, and install more than 60 EV charge stations over the 5-year period of the plan. So most people probably in this group already know this, but really the community transition to fleet really is based on a number of factors, but really for us, it's about achieving our GHG emissions reduction targets. In doing our corporate greenhouse gas emissions inventory, when we created our GHG, or rather our corporate climate action plan, we identified fleet as one of the main emitters of greenhouse gas emissions. But in addition, there's lots of other reasons that we're doing this: improved air quality, reduced noise pollution. Anyone living on a main road knows that it's very challenging to sort of live and work in locations where there's cars that are loud passing by all the time, and EVs are much more quiet. We know that there's also some simplicity in the electric motor design for electric vehicles, and really that results in a lot less maintenance issues associated with those. So in addition to the reduced maintenance cost, we also know that there's cheaper fuel prices, which bring about lower total cost of ownership. And we know that EV fueling costs from municipal charging stations are more likely to remain predictable, relatively unchanging over the next several years. And if I think about my own vehicle right now, my little Volkswagen Golf is costing over $110. I never would have imagined that last year. So really, just for a municipal stability of budgeting purposes, like this makes a lot of sense for us. And then one of the sort of elephants looming in the far edge of the room is that gasoline and diesel prices are anticipated to rise with the federal carbon tax, and EV drivers, including our municipal EV drivers, like in our fleet, could expect that fuel costs will consistently remain lower than the internal combustion engine vehicles that we have in place. So again, in addition to the social environmental impacts of going electric, or reasons for us going electric, there's a number of other conditions that are driving our municipal switch. So in February of 2020, we declared a climate emergency, and really the only way for us to respond to that climate emergency is to take serious actions to reduce our GHG emissions. And so we've targeted our municipal facilities and fleet as priority areas to reduce those emissions. In addition, in March 2020, the municipality set targets to reduce corporate GHG emissions by 35% by 2030 and net zero by 2050. Again, the only way we're going to achieve those targets is by taking these actions. In 2018, our corporate GHG emissions inventory showed, as mentioned, a significant amount of GHGs coming from fleet in the range of at least 15%. And then we've also endorsed the Durham Community Energy Plan, which identifies transportation sector as responsible for up to 47% of region-wide emissions. So it's in our interests also to provide some public charging infrastructure, at least on municipal properties and for the public to use in those locations. I think probably one of the bigger reasons is that we know that the transition to electric vehicles is already underway. We know that in June of 2021, the federal government has set a target for all new passenger vehicles sold in Canada to be electric by 2035, which really is only 13 years. That doesn't give us a lot of time. So if we're not setting the infrastructure up in place now at a more reasonable and planned, in a more reasonably planned way, we're going to be scrambling to do this work later when everyone else is doing the same thing. And 13 years really is not that far off. So a little bit about how we move through the process of creating our EV action plan. Again, early on, we identified that we needed a policy, and the policy basically sets some of the conditions for how our plan was created. But our EV action plan really is to transition the existing municipal fleet to internal combustion engines as the vehicles reach the end of their service life. So we're not talking about getting rid of all of our useful vehicles now, but really as they age out, we'll transition them in. The intention is also to create some incentive for the public also to be able to feel some security that the municipality is working on providing some infrastructure. So to create the plan, the municipality already had an interdepartmental climate change working group that we used basically as a starting point to convene a set of objectives for the plan and to establish milestones. The interdepartmental working group was updated monthly throughout the process of creating the plan. And really they served as a touch point to sort of flag any concerns that staff might have at the outset of the plan. From there, we brought together specific stakeholders from all municipal departments that have direct knowledge of future vehicle acquisitions and really some stake in electric vehicle transition in the municipality. That group created a list of anticipated new replacement vehicle purchases between 2021 and 2026. We reviewed that list and all light duty vehicles with suitable EV replacements over that period, so cars, SUVs, transportation vans, and light duty trucks were counted, and really to create an inventory of anticipated EVs for that transition. Once a number of EVs that were identified that were expected to be purchased over the next 5 years was established, it was used to determine how many charge points we would need in order to fuel those vehicles over that period, and what the transition rate, installation rate of those charge points would be based on the vehicle replacement rate. As a precautionary measure and to leverage available federal funding, the installation of EV stations for fleet was prioritized over the installation of community stations. And we just wanted to make sure that we had, ourselves covered at the fleet level so that there was no service disruptions when that switch in 2035 kind of is flipped. Once the EV action plan was drafted and reviewed by our Interdepartmental Climate Change Working Group, it was circulated more broadly to department heads for internal feedback and for consent from them and for endorsement. Sorry about that. Yep, for endorsement basically, and then several one-on-one meetings were also held with key representatives from community services, emergency fire services, and public works to address specific challenges that their staff might face with the transition to electric. And I will get back to that sort of nearer to the end of the presentation. So a couple of things here about station site selection. This is also integrated into the policy side of things, just so that we have a reference point of how we identify EV station locations in a municipality. But the EVAP focuses on retrofitting existing buildings and parking lots to install EV charge station capacity needs. It's an expectation, and we haven't included this in our plan, but we just expect that all new municipal buildings will integrate public and fleet EV charging into their designs, and that's a component of our policy as well. So really, we're focused within this plan to retrofit existing buildings. Really, a list of potential sites was compiled from municipal properties in order to identify those sites, including buildings and parking lots, and buildings with parking lots. The list was assessed and confirmed by our community services, the facility staff, and then public work staff were also consulted basically to help eliminate locations that were not deemed to be suitable. And what I have here on this slide is basically an overview of what the site selection criteria that we used is. Before we began any of this work, we connected with a professor at Trent University named Joel Bates to work to identify kind of how municipalities, or basically how people will be using these stations and what role the municipality could be using to sort of advance EV charge station infrastructure on municipal properties. So for fleet vehicles, we said all stations need to be near municipal offices or depots where people are working. Really, that's an essential component to this. People have to be working in those areas, fleet staff. There needs to be enough parking spaces for staff and fleet vehicles, because people drive their vehicles to work, park their vehicles, and then they have, the fleet vehicles need to be able to be parked there at nighttime for charging. There's enough space for an adequate grouping of EV stations. We decided that an adequate grouping was 4 to 8 stations, partly because the main cost for installations is in the servicing and not the stations themselves. And so we get an incremental cost savings per charge point if we're over 4 stations. A lot of money can go into just installing 2 charge points. And that there's a transformer, and this is essential, there's a transformer for essential or electrical panel with sufficient capacity to accommodate the stations. We can't charge vehicles if we don't have capacity there. On the public side, we decided to go with a different set of criteria, which basically looked at balancing existing traffic with the potential to attract new users. So we decided to say that there needed to be significant traffic passing through the site, that people might not have to go out of their way to top up their vehicles, or would be going to those sites for a significant amount of time anyways, like a recreation facility to watch a hockey game or to do something like go swimming for a couple of hours or something along those lines. There needed to be a potential to attract users. So some of the sites that we selected were near business areas where a person could come off the highway, park their vehicle, plug it in, and then go for dinner or go check out some of the local attractions. The areas would be currently underserved by charging stations. We didn't want to put a bunch of stations where there were already stations, and we don't really have that concern in Clarington, really, because there's really not that many. But that there would be enough, and that there would be enough space for adequate grouping of stations 4 to 8, and that there's transformer or electrical panel capacity in those locations. So really, this is the breakdown of what we came to with our vehicle purchases over that period of time. We looked at that we'll end up with 25 new vehicles purchased, 39 new public chargers installed, and then 24 new fleet chargers installed. On the fleet side, there is some potential for those stations to be used by fleet and by the public, depending on the location. And I'll get to what that sort of sharing looks like within the policy side of things. We, in addition, this is just a small map of what the community charge, or where the community charge stations are located, or that are proposed to be located. Specifically, most of the locations are at, rather all locations are on municipal properties, and we're specifically looking at again, locations using those site selection criteria that we used. So a number of community facilities, a number of locations that are kind of in more urban areas. So sort of Orono downtown area, Newcastle downtown area on municipal properties, and then Bowmanville downtown area. As for fleet locations, these were locations, again, that staff would be working at, centralized locations so they could drop their vehicles off and then continue on to do their work throughout the day. We actually just finished the completion of an installation of 8 charge points at Garnaby Rickard in downtown Bowmanville, and then some at Fire Station 1 in downtown Bowmanville, because this is where our building inspectors park for the day, and then they'll be switching into their EVs and then continuing on their way. So it's just a central location for people to be parking. Those locations are at one of our recreation facilities, so we're putting signage up again to let people know that during the day they can charge their public vehicles in that location, but after 3 o'clock they need to be freed up for fleet vehicles. So this is just a quick breakdown of the costs associated with the electric vehicle purchases. So again, those 25 vehicles, the overall upfront cost is 1.418 million. But when we did the breakdown for the overall life cycle costs, we actually end up with an overall life cycle savings of those 25 vehicles of $75,000 as a very conservative estimate. And I'd like to sort of have people keep in mind that this was done before the $2 a liter fuel prices that we're seeing right now. So we're expecting that this is the minimum savings that we would experience. Another element of this as well, this doesn't include the resale of the vehicles at the end of their 7-year service life. And in our municipality, the service life of our vehicles is only 7 years or 91,000 kilometers. There could be an extended service life of our vehicles depending on how they perform, but there's also, this is just based on our current usage. On the EV charge station fleet side of things, this is sort of a breakdown of what the upfront or the total costs look like. Thus far, we've been successful 100% of the time with the Zero Emissions Vehicle Infrastructure Program, paying approximately 50% of the overall costs. And then this is the estimated charge station costs for all of those 27 fleet chargers over that period. I just want to note also that we have not included in this public charger cost breakdowns. And part of the reason for that is that we have fees that are associated with the use of those stations, and we've set our fees based on the replacement and payback rates of those stations. So the installation costs are quite similar, but those are actually generating enough of a revenue that they should be covering their costs themselves over the life of the stations. So a couple more considerations here, and this also is integrated into the policy, but we've sort of made it formal in our plan. Emergency and fire staff expressed to us concerns that regarding EV performance during emergency situations. Specifically, staff brought forward concerns regarding towing capacity, battery life, vehicle range during extreme or long use in emergency situations in cold weather. So we know that electric pickup trucks have only recently come to market. And as such, there's not been a lot of a significant amount of time to assess their performance in real world emergency situations, which I think is a very valid concern. And to ensure proven reliability, to ensure proven reliability of vehicles during extended emergency situations, we've decided in this plan to just hold off for this 5-year term to see how some of those vehicles perform. With the understanding that we'll be monitoring vehicle performance in emergency situations, and at our next iteration of an EV action plan, we'll look at integrating our emergency fire vehicles into that system. And we might actually find that electric emergency fire vehicles perform better than our internal combustion engine vehicles, but it wasn't a risk we were willing to take at this point. So shifting over to specifically the policy and how it's structured and the main elements of the policy, there will be some repetition here because our plan is informed by the policy. But really, within the policy, we start out by just stating the purpose, the scope, and the definitions. For us, again, the purpose of the policy is to provide guidance on the design, operations, maintenance of municipal EV charging stations and associated infrastructure. Anything that's sort of outside the stations or would service the stations. And that the policy applies only or this policy anyways, to municipally owned EV charge station infrastructure, which may be made available to the public, municipal staff, and municipal fleet vehicles. A whole section of the policy relates to usage and fees, so how the stations will be used in practice, recommendations for that usage, and how fees will be applied, and under what sort of decision-making rationale. So really, the EV charge parking spaces we have set, and not just us, actually, the province has set this condition as well, but EV charge station parking spaces are solely for EV charge or EVs to use. We've also set the stipulation that the EV user that plugs into the station, whether it's a member of the public or our staff, are responsible for the correct operation of the station itself. They're responsible for learning how to use that station before they ever arrive to the station. And we, at the staff level, have been giving orientation to all staff who will be driving fleet vehicles to ensure that not only do they know how to take full advantage of the efficiencies associated with the use of electric vehicles, but also with the proper usage of the stations to ensure that they have the longest life possible. And part of that is for staff to be who use the vehicles to be able to flag any concerns about the stations as far as maintenance or damage, that they can spot them and report that to the responsible staff members. We have set a fee for the public use of the stations. There's a number of reasons for that. Some of them are related to the replacement rate of the stations themselves. We have set a fee that's intended to cover the costs, the overall replacement costs of the stations at the end of their life. But there's also a bylaw enforcement component to it as well, which I'm going to get into at the bylaw enforcement section of this presentation. But really, it's really to encourage people to not be sitting there with their electric vehicle parked at the station all day long. We want people, after they receive a reasonable amount of charging time, to move so that there's space that's available for someone who needs that spot. User fees are assessed by the total time that the vehicle is connected to the EV station, and the vehicle must be plugged into the station to be parked in that parked spot. And again, this relates to the enforcement side of things. We want to make sure that people are moving their vehicles at least when they're charged, fully charged. And there's no way for our bylaw enforcement staff to know if a vehicle is fully charged. So the way that we have addressed that consideration, which I'll touch on in the bylaw side of things, is we've set user fee rates for the first 3 hours to be $1.50 per hour. And then after 3 hours, that rate goes up to $5 an hour. If a person doesn't have their vehicle plugged in, they don't get charged the fee, and they can be ticketed by our bylaw enforcement. If they remain plugged in, they get charged that $5 an hour fee, which encourages them to move their vehicle. Again, everything is sort of governed by our signage bylaws as well. Again, user fee supported. We're not trying to make money on these things. The intention is to encourage the build out of our electric vehicle charging infrastructure, encourage public adoption of electric vehicles, and get some funds generated to replace the vehicles at the end of their life. And all of that said, within the policy, we've stated that fees will be reviewed every 2 years, and that fleet vehicles also do not pay a fee. So each fleet vehicle has its own RFID card, and in that way, we're able to track specific fleet consumption, which is useful to us to know, to be able to track incremental costs associated with the vehicles themselves, how they're performing as far as cost savings compared to some of the internal combustion engine vehicles, and helps us just to make better, more informed decisions into the future. So here's just a little snapshot of our fee schedule. I actually have to update this to $5 from $4. But again, daytime electric vehicle station use under 3 hours, $1.50 an hour. Daytime electric vehicle station use after 3 hours. And you know, we've put a 30-minute unofficial grace period here in case bylaw enforcement staff aren't walking by in that amount of time. Rather, that doesn't relate to bylaw enforcement. So we've just put an unofficial grace period in here within the protocol of the EV charge station to increase after 3 hours. And then nighttime electric vehicle charge station parking 5 to 7. We've just kept that at $1.50 per hour. And part of that is because we don't want these assets sitting stranded at nighttime if there's people who live in apartment buildings at night. And we know that there's less likelihood of people basically being parked there at nighttime. So we said, okay, well, why not give an opportunity for people who live nearby who might not have a home that has an EV charge station to use these stations at night for a reasonable rate. And then if we ever do integrate a reservation kind of component, we would like to also have a no-show fee. So if a person reserves a parking spot at a certain time and they don't show up, they'll still be charged $3. But that's just for the future. The policy also includes maintenance and who's responsible for that maintenance. So we have also created a responsibilities sort of guide that I will get to in just a second. But really the policy kind of sets out what the day-to-day maintenance, who's responsible, which departments for day-to-day maintenance. And in our municipalities, it's community services, and public works. And the reason for that is because community services, basically a number of the stations are located or will be located at municipal facilities, and community services staff and municipal facility staff are the most suited to sort of monitor those stations. So when they're doing their inspections and rounds and general operations, they'll also be taking a look out the window to see how whether the EV charge stations have been vandalized or there's any challenges that associate with them that aren't being flagged to us by the service provider. The other groupings of stations are located on municipal parking lots. that aren't necessarily associated with specific community buildings. So our public works staff are responsible for metered parking. And when they're there doing their inspections of metered parking, they're also going to be kind of taking a look at and monitoring the stations for maintenance considerations. And all of this said, the cost associated with the maintenance of the stations on the public side are integrated into the fees structure for the use of the stations, but anything that falls outside of that will come from the budgets of those respective departments. Operational issues, similar deal with the addition of bylaw enforcement, because bylaw enforcement, they'll be doing inspections and their rounds for fees paid for the use of the parking lots, and so they're also going to take on an additional role of seeing if vehicles are plugged in, making sure that that all of the bylaws that are associated with the parking, like parking components of the vehicles, are being followed, and if they're not being followed, they're then also responsible for ticketing. And then the other major concern was snow removal and making sure that we were clear about who was responsible for snow removal. Really, our municipality has contractors who do snow removal, and so we're just making sure that all of our snow removal contracts moving forward have snow removal around the EV charge station units as a component of those snow removal contracts. So a component of the policy also relates specifically to municipal fleets. So we've said that, first of all new municipal fleet vehicles will be electric where practicable. And we say where practicable to incorporate that emergency fire exception in there. All fleet vehicles, we've decided for now at least, each vehicle will have a designated charging location. And part of that is so that when a vehicle is at the end of the day and is in most need of a charge, they have a location that they can guarantee that they can go to plug in the vehicle and get their charge. We've only gone with level 2 parking spots for fleet at this point, which are actually for the cost and the balance of the way that we use our vehicles. Most fleet vehicles won't need a full charge at the end of the day and are able to top up that vehicle at the end of the night, so it shouldn't be a concern for us. But if there is a vehicle that has used their complete 400-kilometer range, we're not concerned that over a 12-year period of them charging overnight or more, that they'll not have enough charge for the next day. And really the focus here has been about ensuring no service disruptions. Some parking spaces are designated solely for fleet EVs, and some locations will be for fleet and public. And in locations that are designated for fleet and public, fleet EVs have exclusive access to those stations after 3 p.m. and on weekends. We know that all day on weekdays and on they have exclusive access on weekends and then on civic holidays and statutory holidays. And this is just a logistical thing. If staff aren't coming to the location to pick up the vehicle will stay parked there. We've also stated that all fleet vehicle locations must have signage that's specific to fleet, and this is an enforcement component as well. We already have a signage bylaw for fleet-only vehicle parking spots, and so in order to make EV charge station parking fleet specific, we just needed signs there that say only fleet vehicles can be parked here. And then anything related to bylaw enforcement and ticketing relates to the same signage bylaws that we already have in place. The shared parking spots have to have clear signage saying that they're shared between public and fleet, with clear signage that states when the fleet-only parking comes into effect. And then also all EV parking spots must have EV only parking spots. And we were really clear that to say electric vehicles, because other municipalities have put things like green vehicle parking only. And so then there's certain members of the public who have decided to park their green colored cars in those locations. So we made sure to make sure that it said electric vehicle parking only. And I'm happy to provide people with examples of that signage as well. And then, as I mentioned before, each fleet vehicle has a designated RFID card for network payment cards, and that's to allow us to track the consumption of each vehicle more closely and ensure that there's some accountability around the consumption of energy that's used from those stations. And just a couple more slides here. Looking at another policy component of our policy rather is restrictions and enforcement. So again, I mentioned that only EVs can park in EV parking spots. This is a provincial legislation. EVs must be plugged into the spots while the EV is in the parking spots. This is for our own local bylaw enforcement to ensure that each vehicle would be charged a fee if they do not move their vehicle. Only fleet EVs may park at EV charging stations that are designated that are exclusively for fleet. Signage bylaw covers that. Electrical outlets at municipal facilities may not be used for EV charging except for those designated for use by EVs and clearly designated by a sign. And this is, an instance where a person might decide to plug in an electric vehicle into one of our outdoor facility parking plugins, and we would like to discourage that. And then enforcement related to EV station use and parking is really all done under our fees schedules and under the Clarington traffic bylaw, which sort of stipulates signage. A little bit about policy or data collection and sharing. So all data must comply with the municipality's privacy policies. We made it explicit that the EV charge station provider is also responsible for the maintenance to maintain fees, the fees collected, but also responsible for ensuring compliance with any sort of credit card payment industry standards to make sure that any credit card information that's collected from these stations remains private. We also made a request that any data that's collected is stored in Canada on Canadian servers and is only used under our express consent by the service provider. That municipal staff will use data collected from the stations to monitor the station usage and trends, and that we will assess our own EV policies and our fee structure based on the data that's collected from those stations. Any data that's collected would be retained in accordance with the Municipal Federal Information and Protection by Privacy Act, which just means this is an act that was set up to sort of make sure that no one's personal information has been shared, and that any data collected which may be shared would be anonymized before it would be shared, and that it's up to the discretion of the municipality to decide when and where we share that. We have that clause in our policy because there will be instances where we would want to share EV charge station usage stats with our council, with the regional council as well, and to be able to sort of share that information in order to enable our councillors to make informed decisions about where, why, how we're using EV charge stations for our fleet and for the public. Just a note on design criteria here. Early on, we said that we needed to take accessibility and AODA standards into consideration where practicable. We did say we're practicable because we need to make sure, like anything from an engineering perspective is possible, but not always feasible when it comes to the costs that are associated with things. So where practicable, we're trying to meet AODA standards as far as parking goes for the public for accessible parking. And because of the limited number of EV charge stations that will be at municipal facilities, we want to make sure that they're usable for anybody, regardless of whether they have accessibility issues or not. Those AODA standards were integrated into all aspects of station location design. So where the charge stations would be located, the dimensions of the parking spots as well, signage and pavement markings. So we wanted to make sure that anyone who is looking at signage or pavement markings, that say a person's colorblind or something along those lines, we wanted to make sure that they wouldn't have any concerns with the signage. And then also the EV charge station equipment as well. Like when we were selecting the stations, we took some accessibility criteria into consideration to make sure, for example, to grip the plug and plug it into the vehicle, you didn't have to use a lot of force. And so moving forward, we intend to continue to use accessibility standards in the design of those stations, while also not removing any kind of accessible only parking spots in the process. So just one sort of look here before I close out about the organizational responsibilities. In designing the plan and designing our policy, the questions kept coming up. Well, whose budget is that coming from, or who's the go-to person when it comes to whatever the concern is? And so we identified, based on our organizational structure, a number of roles, departments, and departments who would be responsible for those different roles. So just to go over this quickly, EV station and administration in our municipality really belongs to special projects in our planning and development services department, and then also community services and facilities. And really, these people are just responsible for receiving and responding to emails, phone calls, coordinating repair, replacement, and any continued operation of the EV charge stations, including snow removal. So it's really the go-to person if there's any kind of issues. EV station network lead. So really, that's about guiding the continued expansion of our and implementation of our EV action plan. And really, again, we've designated that to be special projects, but we also have a fleet manager who we consult with about the purchase of the vehicles, and community services heavily involved in that, partly because of the majority of stations being located at those facilities. Site design and assessment, public works. So we have technical services, operations, community services, and facilities. Those are all kind of the go-to team to look at site design and assessment. Fees structure, so finance and accounting services they're responsible for the RFID cards for fleet, for making sure that any fees from the stations are collected and put into an account for later use for replacement of the stations. And they've done a really great job at that. Data management, so again, special projects and finance. We have an asset management team that would be responsible for data management. EV purchases and purchasing of the EV stations. So that's specifically related to our purchasing procurement staff, but we also include our fleet manager in that as well. Accounts maintenance, so really any sort of management of expenditures with any accounts, RFID cards. Again, we just want to make sure that there's a person that is responsible for any challenges associated with that. Enforcement of bylaws, that's bylaw enforcement. EV communications, so that's our office of our CAO and our communication staff. Budgeting for new stations. So this is something that is perhaps unique to our municipality, but each department is responsible for budgeting for the EVs and initial EV charge station installations that will be used for those EVs. So if it's a building inspector vehicle, the building inspectors are responsible for that first purchase, and for the replacement of those stations at the end of their life. Again, community services is responsible for budgeting for EVs that are located at municipal facilities. And then the replacement of those stations over the life of those vehicles will come out of any sort of fees that are collected. And then operations is responsible for budgeting for stations that aren't located at specific facilities. So those operations staff basically we'll look at, you know, municipal parking lots, sort of in alignment with our parking meters. And then sort of last thing about station monitoring and bylaw enforcement, all staff who use EV stations are responsible for monitoring the stations that they're using, but also sort of monitoring the stations that are in sort of close proximity, and they're expected to report any non-functional, vandalized, or damaged stations to the list of administrators in this. So again, the special project staff. Facility staff then are responsible for monitoring any vandalism, damage, operation of the stations at the facilities that they're located at. Operations staff at any sort of municipal parking lots where the stations are located. And then bylaw enforcement, again, is an extra level of monitoring for maintenance purposes, is responsible for, as they do their rounds, to sort of keep an eye on those stations as well. So really, that's the crash course overview of our EV plan, policy, and responsibilities. Really, we know that to achieve our GHG emissions reduction targets, the municipality has to act on electric vehicles, and this is sort of the way that we've approached this with the fleet side of things. We are moving full steam ahead. I have to say, with the plan and policy itself in place, already we're seeing how much more easy it is for us to be making this transition. Before we had the plan and policy in place, funding would come up. We'd scramble to find a bunch of locations for us to be kind of potentially installing stations. We didn't have an idea of how many fleet vehicles we would need and the stations or site selection criteria for those fleet vehicles. We didn't have an idea of where people in the public might want to be doing charging. So really, this policy sets us up to do all that sort of pre-assessment work, let's say in 2022 now, make funding applications for specific EV charge stations with specific locations, let's say in 2022. Hear back from the funders about whether or not we're successful, integrate specific budget asks into our annual budget over the winter, do design work over the winter, let's say 2022, 2023 as an example, and then actually do the installations and break ground first thing in the spring to get that work done over that working year. And then the cycle will continue every year as laid out by our plan. So that's it for me. Thank you very much again for taking the time to listen to, where we're at and how we're moving through our process. If anybody has any questions, thoughts about how we could improve our process, we'd be happy to hear it. And any of the knowledge and resources that we've developed up to this point, we'd be happy to sort of share. Take what we've done, adopt it to your municipality, and hopefully we'll be able to help you leapfrog a little bit and then fast track your public and fleet EV charge station installations on municipal properties. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Doran. That was a very comprehensive presentation. So there are two questions. Are you able to provide an official document of the EV policy framework? For sure. Okay. Yep, I can share that out, or maybe I could share it to you and you would distribute it. Perfect. Yeah, I'll add it as a part of the proceedings. Yep. And no do public charger users have to register their vehicles online to use them, or can they pay at the station? So the charge station service provider that we went with, they have to have either an RFID card or an app. If a person doesn't have the app, it takes about 5 minutes to register, and then they can just tap with their phone. They can also use a phone number that's on the side of the station. If they don't have the RFID card or app, they can call a phone number on the side of the station, enter the number of the station itself, and then enter a credit card. Currently, the protocols aren't in place in our stations to just do point of sale tap service, but we have written into our policy that when that technology comes online, we want it activated so that people can just tap, because we'd like to make it as comprehensive for users as possible. Okay,